Riyadh, 1978. The December heat beyond the threshold of King Khaled's palace was replaced by the deathly chill of air conditioning and the heavy scent of incense. Muhammad Ali, whose body was already beginning to send the first signals of an impending illness, sat in a chair inlaid with
Условия
gold.
приемлемы. Да,
Around
но
him
есть
were
риски.
his entourage, advisors, and the unspoken silence of an absolute monarchy. Before him on a low table lay a leather briefcase. This was not just a diplomatic visit. It was the beginning of the largest deal in human history. At stake were $100 million in cash, a private jet, and the status of the primary symbol of the Islamic world. But behind the glitter of gold lay the fine print. Ali had to stop being an American. The transition from the blinding sun of the desert to the shadowed opulence of the royal chambers felt like stepping into another dimension where time and morality operated under different laws. The air was thick with the aroma of oud and sandalwood, a sensory weight that seemed to press down on the lungs of everyone present. Ali felt the tremor in his hands, a faint vibration that he tried to mask by gripping the gilded armrests of his seat. He was 36, a king in the ring, but a man facing an uncertain twilight. The king sat opposite him, surrounded by an array of ministers who watched the champion with a mixture of reverence and cold calculation. They did not see a boxer. They saw a geopolitical asset, a bridge between the East and the West that could be bought and redirected. The briefcase on the table represented more than just wealth. It was a physical manifestation of an escape route from the mounting debts and the encroaching physical decline that haunted Ali's nights. The silence in the room was surgical, broken only by the hum of the cooling systems and the occasional rustle of silken robes. Every eye was fixed on the champion, waiting for the flicker of greed or the nod of submission. The advisors in Ali's own circle held their breath, their minds racing through the logistics of such a transformation. To them, the offer was a miracle, a way to secure a dynasty for centuries. But for Ali, the cool air of the palace felt increasingly like the atmosphere of a high-stakes trap. The gold leaf on the walls reflected a distorted version of his own face, questioning whether the man who had stood up to the United States government could now be tamed by a foreign crown. The weight of the proposal hung in the space between them, a tangible force that made the vast hall feel claustrophobic. The king's gaze was steady, offering a life of unimaginable luxury in exchange for the one thing Ali had fought hardest to define: his identity. To accept meant to trade the streets of Louisville and the struggle of the American Civil Rights Movement for a gilded cage in the heart of the desert. It meant becoming a ghost in his own country, a figurehead whose words would henceforth be scripted by royal decree. The velvet cushions and the priceless tapestries seemed to close in, transforming the palace from a sanctuary into a showroom where his soul was the primary item on the ledger. As the seconds ticked by, the true cost of the $100 million began to crystallize, revealing a price tag that had nothing to do with currency and everything to do with the essence of who he was. The trap was set with the finest bait ever offered to a mortal man, and the silence of the monarchy demanded an answer that would either solidify his legend or dissolve it into the shifting sands of the Arabian Peninsula. While polite small talk flowed like honey in the grand reception halls, a cold calculator began to whir inside Ali's mind. His financial state was a house of cards that could barely stand. An entourage of 50 people devoured his fight purses faster than he could earn them. Endless charity, failed investments, and staggering taxes had left him with nearly empty pockets at the sunset of his career. The world champion title was in his hands, but the future held only fog and the creeping fear of poverty. That night, in the opulent guest quarters, his advisors scribbled figures on napkins. "Muhammad, this is money for 10 generations ahead. Your grandchildren will be kings, or you will return to the States and be bankrupt within 5 years." The shadows in the suite felt heavier than the gold-threaded tapestries. Every rhythmic tick of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece sounded like a countdown toward a looming disaster. Ali paced the marble floor, his footsteps echoing against the silence of a palace that offered everything he lacked: stability and an end to the frantic hustle of the boxing circuit. He thought of the sprawling training camps, the hangers-on who treated his bank account like a public fountain, and the relentless pressure of being the greatest while having to worry about next month's overhead. The physical toll of the ring was already manifesting in a subtle slowing of his speech and a ghost of a tremor, yet his financial obligations were accelerating. His advisors leaned over the low tables, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of lamps, looking like conspirators in a drama that had no script but survival. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones about the reality of his bank balances and the predatory nature of the tax authorities waiting for him back home. The contrast was agonizing. Outside the window, the kingdom of oil and ancient tradition promised a life where he would never have to step into a ring again, where his image would be sanctified and his family's bloodline elevated to global royalty. But the price was a spiritual amputation. He looked at his reflection in the darkened glass, seeing a man caught between two worlds. One world offered the raw, chaotic struggle of the American streets that had forged him, a place where he was free to be a hero or a villain, but where the safety net was made of razor wire. The other world offered a gilded silence, a permanent vacation from the burden of choice, funded by the largest bribe ever conceived. The napkins on the table, covered in frantic ink, represented the logic of the world. They showed the math of a comfortable surrender. Every zero added to the king's offer was a nail in the coffin of his American identity. The weight of his legendary generosity now felt like a millstone. He had given millions away to strangers, built gyms, fed the hungry, and supported a small army of friends. And now the bill for that kindness was being presented in a language he didn't want to speak. The advisors didn't see the soul of the champion. They saw a failing business that had one last chance to merge with a superpower. As the night deepened, the air in the room grew stagnant with the smell of expensive tobacco and the stench of desperation. The countdown wasn't just about the money. It was about the expiration date on his ability to say no. He was being asked to choose between a future as a wealthy ghost in the desert or a struggling legend in the land that had both hated and adored him. The math was simple, but the answer felt like it could break him. The moment of truth arrived. King Khaled clarified the details: a full renunciation of the United States, obtaining Saudi citizenship, and the permanent relocation of his entire family to the desert. Ali looked at his wife Veronica, seeing in her eyes a mixture of horror and temptation. The confrontation between the greatest and the mercenary reached its peak. The night turned into a psychological thriller. Ali realized that if he signed the documents, he would forever fall silent as a free man. His voice would no longer belong to him. It would belong to the kingdom's Ministry of Information. The spiritual value of his conversion to Islam would be devalued to the exchange rate of the rial. The heavy silence of the guest quarters felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest with more force than any punch he had ever absorbed in the ring. The blue American passport lying on the nightstand seemed to glow under the dim lamps, a small book of fabric and paper that suddenly outweighed $100 million. To surrender it was to erase the man who had stood on the banks of the Ohio River and the man who had defied the draft board in Houston. He paced the length of the room, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the hand-woven carpets, mimicking the internal distortion of his own soul. The proposal was not just a career move, it was a total reconstruction of his reality. He imagined the headlines in the American papers, the sense of betrayal that would ripple through the neighborhoods of Louisville and Chicago, and the hollow feeling of being a king in a land where he was essentially a prized exhibit. Veronica sat motionless, the fine silk of her gown shimmering in the low light, her silence a mirror of the impossible choice before them. She saw the security of a life without struggle, a sanctuary for their children where money would never be a question again. Yet she also knew the fire that lived in her husband's heart. Ali felt the walls of the palace closing in, the marble and gold transforming into a fortress that would keep the world out, but also keep him in. He understood that the king was not asking for a boxer, he was asking for a soul to decorate his court. If he became a Saudi citizen, he would become a puppet of the state, a magnificent figurehead who could never again speak truth to power because he would be a part of that power. His mind raced through the implications of the fine print. Every speech he would give, every country he would visit, and every word he would utter about his faith would be scrutinized by handlers and officials. The raw, unfiltered charisma that had shaken the world would be filtered through a royal lens, sanitized and packaged for diplomatic purposes. His faith, which had been his shield and his sword during his darkest years in the wilderness of the late 60s, would become a commercial product. The very essence of his rebellion, the idea that a black man in America could define himself on his own terms, would be traded for the ultimate comfort. He stared out the window at the starlit horizon of the Nejd, where the ancient sands met the infinite sky. The desert was beautiful, but it was not his. It did not hold the memories of his childhood, the scars of his battles, or the pulse of the people who had walked with him through the fires of controversy. The realization began to settle in his bones like a cold draft. To sign that paper was to execute Muhammad Ali and replace him with a well-funded ghost. The psychological tension of the night pulled at the fibers of his being, forcing him to confront the terrifying possibility that the greatest could be bought, and that his legendary defiance had a final, numerical price. The shadow over his passport was the shadow of a man about to lose himself in a sea of gold. The conference hall was packed with security and officials who had already prepared the documents for the ceremonial signing. King Khaled, confident in his power, even increased the stakes, adding a private mosque in any part of the world. Ali stood up. The air in the room became dense, like the moment before a knockout. He spoke the words of refusal, calmly, without shouting, but leaden heavy. He explained that his faith had no price tag, and his home was the dusty streets of Louisville, where his voice carried power precisely because it was not bought. Shock reigned in the hall, turning into a deathly silence. The translator froze, afraid to translate the refusal to the richest man on the planet. The golden walls of the palace seemed to vibrate with the unspoken weight of the rejection. Ali stood tall, his frame casting a long shadow over the mahogany table and the waiting pens. The diplomats exchanged panicked glances, their eyes darting between the champion and the monarch, unable to process a reality where $100 million was not enough. To them, the offer was a life raft for a sinking career, but to Ali, it was a chain forged in 24-karat gold. He looked directly at the king, his gaze unwavering, projecting the same defiance that had once faced down the draft boards of the United States government. The physical tremor in his hands seemed to vanish in that moment of absolute moral clarity. He spoke of the neighborhoods back home, of the black children in Chicago and the struggling families in Kentucky who looked to him as a symbol of unbought dignity. He made it clear that to accept this fortune would be to betray every person who had ever drawn strength from his independence. If he became a mouthpiece for a foreign crown, he would become a ghost to his own people. The spiritual gravity of his words hung in the refrigerated air, clashing with the scent of expensive oud and the cold precision of the legal contracts. He was choosing the uncertainty of his own future over the guaranteed comfort of a royal court. The translator eventually began to murmur the words in Arabic, his voice trembling as he delivered the blow to the king's pride. Every sentence felt like a hammer striking the polished marble floor. Ali described how his conversion to Islam was a journey of the soul, not a business transaction to be settled in a boardroom. To monetize his faith would be to kill the very thing that gave him life. The advisors who had urged him to sign looked down at their feet, their dreams of a commission and a life of ease evaporating in the heat of his resolve. The king sat motionless, his face an unreadable mask of tradition and power. He was a man used to the world bending to his will through the sheer force of his treasury. Yet here was a man from across the ocean who treated his millions like pocket change. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the breath out of the room. The guards at the doors stood like statues, their hands tight on their weapons, sensing the shift in the atmosphere from a celebration to a historic confrontation. Ali did not sit back down. He remained standing, a solitary figure of integrity in a room designed for submission. He had just delivered the most significant punch of his life, not with a glove, but with a refusal that echoed louder than any roar from a stadium crowd. The documents on the table suddenly looked like worthless scraps of paper, overshadowed by the massive presence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. The thud of his rejection was the thunder in the throne room, a sound that would be whispered about in the corridors of power for decades to come. He had looked at the ultimate temptation and walked away with his soul intact. King Khalid's reaction changed everything. Instead of anger, the monarch felt an almost religious awe. He realized he had met a man who could not be bought, a phenomenon nearly impossible in his world. The king publicly recognized Ali as his brother and declared that the refusal of the money made him even more majestic in the eyes of the Muslim world than any knockout victory. The diplomatic deal transformed into an act of supreme nobility. Ali left the palace without a check for $100 million, but with something that could not be taken from him even by illness or time: absolute honesty with himself. The transition from the cold, tense air of the throne room to the blinding light of the courtyard felt like a spiritual ascent. The advisors who had whispered of bankruptcy and ruin now walked in a stunned, respectful silence behind the man they had tried to sell. The king had watched Ali with eyes that had seen the most powerful men on earth bow to the influence of oil and gold, yet he saw in the boxer a sovereign power that needed no treasury. By rejecting the fortune, Ali had unwittingly conquered the very heart of the kingdom. The news of his refusal rippled through the palace corridors, reaching the ears of the guards, the servants, and the high-ranking ministers, shifting the atmosphere from one of transactional business to one of profound myth-making. As Ali walked toward the waiting motorcade, the heavy weight of his financial future seemed to lift, replaced by a lightness he had not felt since the early days of his career. He understood that his value was no longer measured by the length of his reach or the speed of his jab, but by the immovable nature of his soul. The golden gates of the palace swung open, but they no longer felt like the bars of a cage. The desert wind carried the scent of freedom, a sharp contrast to the suffocating luxury of the chambers he had just abandoned. He had walked into the palace as a champion looking for a way out of debt, and he was walking out as a legend who had found a way into history. The king's embrace before his departure had been more than a royal gesture. It was an admission that there were forces in the world greater than the wealth of nations. The whispered conversations among the Saudi elite began to frame Ali not as a guest, but as a moral giant whose presence graced their land precisely because he sought nothing from it. The spiritual integrity he had guarded so fiercely in the United States had survived the ultimate test in the cradle of his faith. He looked at the vast, shimmering horizon of Riyadh and saw not a lost opportunity, but a reaffirmed path. The private jet that had been promised as a gift remained on the tarmac, a gleaming monument to a life he chose not to lead. Instead, Ali moved toward the future with the same rhythmic grace that had once mesmerized millions in the ring, his head held high, his identity uncompromised. The world would eventually learn of this day, of the night he spent wrestling with the devil of greed, and the morning he emerged victorious without throwing a single punch. The birth of this legend beyond the ring was cemented in the dust of the palace driveway, a legacy built on the solid rock of a refusal that echoed louder than any roar of a stadium crowd. He had lost a fortune, but he had saved the man the world called Muhammad Ali. He was returning to the struggle, to the noise of America, and to the creeping shadows of his own health. But he was doing so with a spirit that remained entirely, stubbornly, and beautifully his own. Years passed. Ali fought Parkinson's, his movements becoming stiff and his speech turning quiet. The financial difficulties his advisors had warned him about caught up with him, but he never once regretted that night in Riyadh. Every time he was asked about that offer, he only smiled, almost imperceptibly. The story ends with a shot of the aging champion sitting in his home in the USA. He was not wealthy by billionaire standards, but he was free. His refusal of the golden captivity became his greatest title, proving to the whole world that there are things that cost more than all the treasures of kings. The quiet of the Michigan farmhouse was a far cry from the marble echoes of the Saudi palace. The air here was filled with the scent of mown grass and the distant hum of American life, not the heavy incense of a royal court. Ali sat by the window, his hands resting on his knees, moving with a rhythm he could no longer control. The physical decline was relentless, stripping away the speed that had once defied the laws of physics. Yet his eyes retained a clarity that no disease could dim. He watched the shadows of the trees lengthen across the lawn, reflecting on a life lived without the safety net of $100 million. The creditors had come. The lavish entourage had vanished like a desert mirage, and the mansions had been traded for more modest roofs. But the peace in his heart remained undisturbed. In the twilight of his existence, the silence that surrounded him was not the silence of a man who had been silenced, but the silence of a man who had said everything he needed to say. He remembered the desperate faces of his advisors that night in 1978, their frantic ink on napkins and their prophecies of doom. They had been right about the money, but they had been wrong about the man. He had seen fellow icons sell their names, their faces, and their very beliefs to the highest bidder, becoming walking billboards for products and ideologies they did not own. Ali had remained the sole proprietor of his soul. Every time the world looked at him, they did not see a paid ambassador or a corporate puppet. They saw a man who had looked at the ultimate bribe and blinked only to offer a smile of rejection. The weight of the decision in Riyadh had become the foundation of his final legacy. It was the moment he proved that the greatest was not a marketing slogan, but a moral reality. Even as his voice faded to a whisper, the resonance of that "no" grew louder with each passing decade. People came from all over the world to sit in that same silence with him, seeking not the fighter, but the person who had demonstrated that integrity was the only currency that did not devalue. His children and grandchildren grew up knowing that their father's name was not a brand bought by a kingdom, but a testament to a free man's will. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light that reminded him of the palace walls he had once walked away from, Ali felt no bitterness. The tremors in his limbs were merely the rustling of a spirit that had fought the hardest battles and won the only prize that mattered. He was a man of the people, an American who had stayed with his people through the fire and the frost. The golden cage had remained empty, and he remained whole. The final frame of his life was painted not in the gold of a foreign crown, but in the soft, enduring light of a conscience that had never been for sale. He had paid the price of silence, and in return, he had earned a legend that would never fade.